It's no secret that it's tough to get bread right. Screw up just one thing and you'll end up with a loaf that didn't rise, one that got super dense, or one that's still goopy in the middle. Here are the most common pitfalls standing between you and a perfect loaf. Back when your parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents used to bake bread, chances are they only had one option when it came to flour. That's definitely not the case today. While you still might choose all-purpose flour for some breads, there's also whole wheat flour, almond flour, white whole wheat flour, and so on and so on. And each of those flours acts a little differently. According to the experts, treating them all the same and trying to use them interchangeably will absolutely ruin your bread. Say you use grandma's recipe for bread, which may have been written with all-purpose flour in mind. You want a loaf of wheat bread, though, and it's not going to work as written. Whole wheat flour is much more absorbent than the recipe's assuming your flour is, and you'll end up using more water and getting a super sticky dough that's incredibly hard to knead right. That's even further complicated by the fact that coarse whole wheat flour will break up gluten and protein chains if it's overworked, and you'll end up with a loaf that crumbles instead of cuts. Every type of flour has different properties, so match your flour to your recipe, and it'll be easier to get your proportions 100% correct. We're all looking for ways to get healthier, and it might seem like swapping low-fat oils or butters into your bread is an easy way to cut back. But it's not, and here's why. Fats play a key role in the chemistry of baking. They're necessary for lubricating the dough and retaining gases, which not only helps the loaf rise, but also keeps it fresh. When you're using a standard, full-fat version of whatever butter or oil you're mixing into your dough, you're probably fine. The problems start when you try to use reduced fat ingredients, partially because the lower fat content means you'd have to use more than the recipe calls for to get the same effect. And that's going to mess up your water and liquid ratios. Also, reduced fat spreads and butters are made with a different process than the regular kind. Since they have more water, a different chemical emulsion is needed to keep the water and fats mixed. So when you go to mix it into your dough, it's not going to incorporate as well as a full-fat product would. You should always make sure you're using an ingredient that contains 70% or more fat. Otherwise, your bread is going to be tough, chewy, and dry. Whether it's white sugar, brown sugar, molasses, or fruit juice, sugars essentially act as the fuel for yeast. Yeast needs it to work and undergo the process that's going to make your bread rise. If there's not enough sugar, the yeast isn't going to work well because it doesn't have enough of that fuel to feed on. But if you add too much sugar, you'll end up getting the same lackluster effect, this time because the extra sugar is stealing water away from the yeast. That's why sweet breads always call for more yeast than savory ones. And here's another thing. If you add your yeast and then sugars right on top of it, it'll slow the process down and your bread's not going to rise. To get this particular process to work right, you'll have to mix it precisely according to your recipe. Yeast also doesn't feed on artificial sweeteners, so you can't use them to replace sugar and get the same loaf of bread. And the darker the sugar, the more quickly the bread is going to brown. So keep that in mind when you're setting your time and temperature. Hydration is exactly what it sounds like. It's the amount of liquid in your dough. One of the most common reasons a loaf doesn't rise is because it doesn't have the right liquid-to-flour ratio. A well-proportioned dough shouldn't stick to your hands or to the side of the mixing bowl in a way that makes it frustrating to peel off. It should only feel tacky to the touch, and when it does, that means the dough is the right environment for the gluten to stretch and the yeast to feed, releasing carbon dioxide to cause the bread to rise. It's not just water you have to worry about. You also have to consider milk, fruit juices, and sneakier sources of moisture like eggs, fats, or liquid sweeteners. Keep that in mind if you're tempted to add something the recipe doesn't call for. It's all going to change what's happening in your dough. Just because the water coming out of your tap is safe to drink doesn't mean it's going to make for great bread. If there's chlorine in your water, it can interfere with the way enzymes in the dough work, and that'll change the final product. Yeast is also super sensitive to chlorine, so if you've got chlorinated water running through your pipes, you might want to filter it for the sake of making bread. If you have hard water, which is to say water with high levels of calcium and magnesium ions, that's also going to interfere with the chemical process of your baking. The gluten won't be as pliable and the fermentation rate will slow, but having water that's too soft is just as bad.
They gotta be soft. How soft? But not too soft.
Without those minerals, your dough won't form into that firm ball you're looking for. If your tap water isn't right down the middle on the hardness scale, you might want to find an alternative.
Not too hard, not too soft.
Here's a mistake that's super easy to make, especially considering most of us aren't used to cooking with ingredients that are actually living things like yeast. While most ingredients are fine if they sit in your cupboard for a while, if that dry yeast has been there for a bit, it might be dead. It also might be dead if it was stored improperly or past its best if used by date. This is one of those times those dates actually mean something's really honestly gone off, because yeast will become less and less active with age. That's even true if you haven't opened it yet. Properly storing your yeast is crucial too, and if it's kept in a way that brings it into contact with air, heat, or moisture, it's going to degrade very quickly. So keep it in a cool, dry place in your fridge or in your freezer. Whether you're kneading by hand or with a stand mixer, it's a crucial part of the process that's incredibly easy to get wrong. Kneading bread develops not just gluten, but in turn also develops a sort of straight network of proteins that allows bread to rise while still holding together. But here's the thing, if you don't knead bread long enough, you won't get enough air in the dough. But if you knead it too much, you're also going to damage your dough. The movement of the dough, your hands, and the dough hook is going to cause too much heat to build up and too much air to get into the mix, which will make a loaf that doesn't have too much flavor. The key is to look for a few things in your dough. It should easily pull free of the sides of the bowl or your work surface. And when you pull it, it should remind you a bit of a rubber band in the way it snaps back. If that's your dough, stop kneading. Not everyone has a stand mixer, and you certainly don't need one to knead bread. But according to America's Test Kitchen, having one saves you from making a few mistakes. For starters, it means you're working the dough in a more uniform fashion. It takes a lot of muscle to knead dough in a regular way for 20 to 25 minutes after all. But there's something else at work here too. You're also keeping your liquid to flour ratios more exact. What's the first thing you do when you're kneading by hand? You sprinkle some flour on the work surface, on your hands, and on the dough to keep it from sticking. You'll probably do that a few more times over the course of the kneading process, and if you use too much flour, that can turn into a huge mistake. While some doughs might need a little extra flour, they're not going to need a lot, not if you're following the recipe right at least. If you do add too much, it's going to change the texture of your loaf into something you're not going to want to replicate, ever. Baking bread is tricky, and you can even make mistakes as you're doing nothing but watching the clock. First off, never forget to cover your bread with a protective little hat. And that's not even a joke. A shower cap can work pretty brilliantly for this step. You can also use plastic wrap or a clean tea towel. You're basically covering it to keep the moisture in. That'll also keep the skin of the dough from drying out too much, but there's nothing wrong with it drying slightly. Breaking that skin when you're splitting your dough and putting it into bread pans is a mistake too, because if you don't break that super thin skin, you'll be able to cut long, deliberate slashes in the top to give the bread a place to break and fold as it bakes and expands, which will give you a much better looking loaf. How many times have you pulled a loaf of bread out of the oven and been disappointed that it didn't rise much? Your mistake might not have had anything to do with the recipe or ingredients at all. It may have risen just fine, but if you used the wrong size pan, it certainly won't look that way. And we're not even talking about a huge difference in pan sizes. You might have 2 different size bread pans in your cupboards right now and not even realize it. There's 9 by 5 inch pans and there's 8.5 by 4.5 inch pans. Is that really enough to make a difference? Yes, it is. The bigger pans are actually for breads that don't use yeast, like your favorite banana bread. The smaller pans are for breads that call for yeast, and that 1/2 inch makes a huge difference. Do the math and you'll find that the bigger pan actually has about 30% more room in it, and that means yeast breads aren't going to rise as big and tall in the bigger pan. Size does matter. You've measured and mixed, kneaded and proofed, and finally, you've baked. You're in the clear now, right? Not exactly. If you've ever pulled the pan out of the oven and left it somewhere to cool, you're not doing it any favors. The most you should do is let yeast bread rest in the pan for about 5 minutes, then transfer it to a wire rack. That 5 minutes isn't always necessary either, and it's only to allow a slightly wobbly loaf to firm up a bit. Ideally, you'll want to transfer it to a rack immediately after taking it out of the oven. That'll prevent the crust from getting tough, and no one wants a super tough crust. Here's another tip for getting the crust just right. If your bread seems to be as brown as you want it, but it still has some baking time left, don't take it out of the oven early. Just cover it gently with a piece of aluminum foil and let it finish the bake time. That way, you should be able to take it out of the pan immediately. Look at it this way, it'll cool faster and it'll be ready to eat faster too. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more mashed videos about your favorite foods are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.